it's hard to argue with the results that finesse fishing can produce once we make it into those dreaded dog days of summer. We're dealing with peak water temperatures, maximum amount of daylight hours, in a lot of places, a big algae bloom, nearly everywhere, peak bait populations. There's one. And cracking that code can be a challenge, but not when we slow down and go small. Now that phrase finesse fishing is going to mean different things to different people. But for me, when I think about finesse fishing during the dog days of summer, I think about presenting some version of the Ned Rig. Ned rigging is as simple as it is versatile. We can fish the Ned Rig in shallow water or deep. We can fish it around, there's a good one. We can fish it around weeds or wood or rocks or docks or really any sort of cover for that matter. We'll get a nice walleye. Oh yeah. Nice. Look at that guy, huh? That's a nice Ned Rig walleye right there. Huh? Sweet. Ned rigging originated as a summer bass technique, a way to reliably catch fish during those dog days when really little else was working. But in reality, Ned rigging is a fantastic way to tap into a rich multi-species bite, and it's one of my favorite ways to fish during the dog days of summer. So on this week's episode of On the Water with the Technological Angler, we're going to talk Ned rigging. I'm going to teach you how I use Humminbird's MEGA Side Imaging to break down the water and find those midsummer fish faster. I'll show you how I use Humminbird's MEGA Live Imaging in forward-looking mode to monitor all of that Ned rigging action beneath the surface in real time. And finally, I'll show you all the gear you need to make Ned rigging a central part of your midsummer fishing routine. Let's get started. We can't talk about midsummer fishing without also talking about the thermocline. Most deeper lakes that don't have a lot of water moving through them will stratify by midsummer. That means we'll have a layer of generally warmer water toward the surface and also a layer of generally colder water toward the bottom. The warmer water toward the surface will transition to that colder water toward the bottom in a relatively narrow band, which is called the thermocline. You might think that during the heat of midsummer, fish might want to be found below the thermocline, in that cooler water that's closer to the bottom. But that's really not the case. In general terms, water below the thermocline is very low in dissolved oxygen. It can't support most fish. On typical smaller inland lakes like I'm on today, I think about the thermocline as being a barrier. Fish will have to be found near the thermocline or above it, or in other words, between the thermocline and the surface. Now the thermocline is really easy to identify with your traditional 2D sonar. In fact, it's hard to miss it. On this lake, the thermocline is currently setting up right around 20 feet. That means every fish that I want to catch is going to be between the surface and 20 feet down. So when it comes to finding fish here in midsummer, I really have two choices. I could fish out here in the main lake basin and hunt for fish that are suspended near or above the thermocline. The other option is to go and fish shallow structure, something that will serve to concentrate fish in one general area and not be impacted by that hard thermal barrier. And for me, when I'm Ned rigging in midsummer, that's generally the choice that I'm going to make. So we turn our attention then to some shallow water that's going to be above the thermocline. And on this particular lake, the focus is really going to be around shorelines. And so we use Humminbird Side Imaging to assess what that shallow shoreline-oriented habitat looks like. So let's begin by talking about bottom composition. So as we look at the bottom here in this near shore area, we see that the bottom between my boat's position and the shoreline is generally pretty bright. Now, a bright bottom return is consistent with hard bottom. So this could be hard packed sand or gravel or rock. Here, there's no other features in the general area other than that bright bottom, so we can assume that this is largely sand. As we look out to the left, out into that deeper water of the basin, we see that the bottom is substantially darker. So this is a soft bottom area, mud or muck, something like that. So we've got a soft basin surrounded by a hard shoreline area that looks like it's largely sandy. Now what we see off to the right, starting at around 60 feet to the right of the boat, are weeds. These are weed returns that extend from around 60 feet all the way up to the shoreline. The shoreline's about 100 feet off to the right. Now the primary sonar returns from those weeds are the irregular blotchy white areas. You'll also see some dark spots that are on the outside of those weed returns. Now those are the sonar shadows that come from the weeds, right? Real prominent sonar shadows that come from the weeds are consistent with real tall growing weeds that block that side imaging beam from getting beyond them. Right, we see some areas of weeds that have a lot of that shadowing. We see other areas that have very little shadowing, and so those would be consistent with shorter growing weeds. And so we've got some variability here. We've got some short weeds, we've got some taller weeds as well. Here we see that sand continuing all the way up to the edge of the weeds. Looks like we've got some indication of maybe a few fish, certainly a little bit of small rock that is between the boat's position and the weed line there, starting at about 50 feet to the right of the boat and continuing to the edge of the weeds. It looks like mostly rock. Looks like there might be a few fish in there as well. Now, that little rock pile outside of the weed line is different from a lot of the other areas that I've searched, so I'm just going to go ahead and drop a waypoint on that. It might be something we come back and fish later on as something that is different from the majority of the habitat that we're looking at. Here, right off this little weed point off on the right-hand side, it looks like we've got a collection of fish. Remember, fish are going to show up as bright white sonar returns with dark sonar shadows. And when the bottom is this bright from that hard packed sand, sometimes it can be hard to see the bright white sonar returns, but what stands out real prominently are those dark sonar shadows. And so if you go past an area where it looks like somebody has sprinkled pepper all over your side imaging view, especially over hard bottom, that's consistent with a collection of fish. Now, if we can see both the bright white primary sonar return and the dark sonar shadow, and there's any separation at all between those two, then we are 100% guaranteed that that bright white object, that bright white primary sonar return, that's a fish that is suspended at least a little bit off the bottom. So here's an example of a small collection of returns here just off on the left-hand side of the side imaging view. We've got 2 bright white primary sonar returns, and we've got 5 dark sonar shadows. Now, it's possible that those are rocks, but I would say it's not likely because it looks like there's at least a little bit of separation between the bright white returns and the 2 dark sonar shadows, right? And then we have 3, let's call them unexplained sonar shadows, right? If those were rocks, we would see the bright white return from the rock in contact with that dark sonar shadow. But we have 3 dark sonar shadows over there with nothing that could obviously be creating them. And so I would conclude that all 5 of those objects are probably fish. Something notable here, so here we've got the weed growth again on the right-hand side between myself and the shore that extends much farther out away from shore than it does in a lot of the other places. So I look at this as being more habitat rich than some of the other parts of the lake where the weeds are growing relatively tight to shore. Notice also that there's a mix of some low growing weeds and some much taller weeds that are throwing off big shadows, right? So this is a weedy area. It doesn't have rocks or wood or cribs, but it's more weeds between this deeper water I'm out here in 10 feet and the shoreline that's over to my right. And so this is another place that can hold fish, and it looks like we've got a collection of dark sonar shadows right on that outside weed line. And so those would be some of the fish that we'll try to come back and get with Ned rigs here in a little bit. There's one. Oh, it's a long fish. Muskie or a pike. Pike. Everybody loves the Ned rig. Gotcha. None the worse for wear. Now that we've switched to fishing, my primary sonar tool is going to switch from side imaging, which is for searching, for looking around, to Humminbird's MEGA Live as my real-time tool to help me present the Ned rig to the fish. And right now I'm fishing an area that is largely weeds. It's a spot where I saw some fish on side imaging before, kind of hanging off the edge of these weeds. And so just going to work my way along this long weed edge and use MEGA Live in forward-looking mode as my guide. For a shallow casting presentation like this, we really have two options with MEGA Live. We could use MEGA Live in landscape mode to give us that kind of panoramic view of what's going on all around us, or we could use it in forward mode. And the reason that I'm leaning toward using forward mode here is that it's going to allow me to follow that jig in real time, that real lightweight Ned rig, as it tickles along the tops of the weeds. And keeping that bait in kind of in direct contact with the cover, and then letting it fall into the little nooks and crannies is really a way to call fish out and get more bites by the end of the day. So let me start by talking about how I have my MEGA Live transducer configured, kind of the hardware configuration. First of all, I'm using the transducer set with an angle of 70 degrees. So that's 7 clicks up from straight up and down. I'm also using the large foam mask. So that's the larger of the two sizes that is provided with that MEGA Live transducer. And I have that larger foam mask covering the upper portion of the transmit window, that semicircle that the MEGA Live beam is broadcast from. Now, of course, I have my transducer mounted on a external live sonar pole. This is the live sonar pole system from TKICNC.com. Been using it all year. I strongly believe that this is the best live sonar pole on the market. Now on my pole, I have the center of the beam aligned with the handle, so the beam is being transmitted out in this direction aligned with the handle. And so what I'll want to do is just kind of rotate that beam back and forth, sweep it through the area that I'm fishing around, and use it to identify kind of my casting lane. And then once I have my casting lane identified, I'll just make sure that I place my cast aligned with that beam, and that's going to allow me to see my bait land in the water and follow it all the way back to the boat. So those are my hardware settings. Now let's talk about the software settings for live on my Apex 13. So first, let's talk about range. I have my forward range here set between 60 and 70 feet. That's kind of what I've been using today. That represents a nice, comfortable casting distance, really, with my real lightweight Ned Rig. So I'm looking out as far as I'm going to be casting. My down range, I'll adjust based on the depth of the water that I have the boat positioned in. So right now the boat's positioned in about 8 feet of water, so I've got my down range set to around 12 feet. And I'll just, as my boat's position changes, as the water depth under the boat changes, I'll just sort of scale that down range accordingly, but keep that forward range at my nice, comfortable casting distance. For my forward display mode, I'm using the auto setting. When I choose auto, I'm asking the system to use inputs from the AHRS sensors that are built into that MEGA Live transducer to set the appropriate forward display angle. I'll configure the rest of my settings by starting with my dynamic contrast value, and here I'm using a dynamic contrast of low. Low dynamic contrast is what I'm going to choose anytime I'm in a relatively clear or clean water environment, and certainly this lake has really nice water clarity, so it's really good for a low dynamic contrast. Low dynamic contrast is also going to be good anytime I want to really focus on following my lure back into the boat using forward mode, and that's obviously one of the things that I'm focusing on here, is using forward mode to follow that Ned Rig as it moves along those weed tops. For my other key MEGA Live settings, those being sensitivity and contrast, I'm always going to begin with sensitivity and contrast both set to 10 and then make adjustments from there. Now remember, when we increase our MEGA Live contrast, we're going to be knocking down noise. We're going to be eliminating those really weak signals. When we reduce MEGA Live contrast, that's going to be something that's going to show us more of those weak signals and can be really effective at providing the information we need to be able to see our lure, especially a real lightweight small one like this Ned Rig. When we make changes to MEGA Live sensitivity, we're not really going to be changing the number of live sonar returns that we see on the display. Instead, changes to MEGA Live sensitivity will make those returns that are already visible either brighter or less bright. So in other words, if I use a color palette like I like, which is number 13 in forward mode here, increasing my MEGA Live sensitivity is going to add color to the returns that are already visible, make them easier to see. Reducing my MEGA Live sensitivity here is going to remove color from those same returns. The returns are already going to be set there, already going to be there. I'm just going to make them more colorful or less colorful. If I use one of the monochrome color palettes, I'm going to be making those same returns either more bright or less bright. Again, making them more visible, easier to see, or less visible. There's a fish. Got him. When we adjust our MEGA Live settings, we really want to keep kind of our goals and objectives in mind. Let's see what we got here. Oh, nice largemouth. Oh. Oh, fatty. It's a nice fish. Now here, my objective is that I want to be able to see my cast when it hits the water and follow my cast, follow my Ned Rig down along those weed tops. And so I've made my sensitivity and contrast and dynamic contrast settings based on trying to achieve that goal of following my lure. That's why I'm using a low dynamic contrast and the values of sensitivity and contrast that I have set here. From my perspective, one of the big advantages that MEGA Live offers for a presentation like this is it allows me to see all the detail of that weed bed as I'm working my bait back towards the boat, so I can see where all the little pockets and indentations are, and seeing where those little pockets are relative to my bait's real-time position lets me drop that lure right in the place and be able to catch more fish. Like this little peanut. Ned rigging is elegantly simple. There's a fish. Functionally, what we have is a compact soft plastic, something without a lot of curly tails and appendages and things like that, rigged on a real lightweight jig. Now, the bait itself, like this one here, little guy, the bait itself is generally something that's going to be made from a thermoplastic elastomer, a soft plastic called TPE. It's very stretchy, as you can see. It's really hard to get it to break, and it's buoyant. So rather than a traditional soft plastic that if I tugged on it, it would break, and if I threw it in the lake, rigged on a jig, it would sink all the way to the bottom real fast. TPE, because it's buoyant, has a much slower rate of descent through the water column. And I think that the simplicity of the lures and the rate of descent through the water column have a lot to do with the effectiveness of the Ned Rig. The company that's put the biggest effort into developing Ned rigging into the fish catching machine that it is today is Z-Man Fishing Products. Z-Man's baits are all made from that TPE material. They call it Elastec. As I said, super stretchy and buoyant. They make a wide range of different kinds of profiles or shapes that would be appropriate for Ned rigging. I like 2 or 3 of them. I like what's called a Finesse TRD. It looks like half of a stick worm, but it's more than that. I'm throwing right now a bait called a Hula Sticks. And I also like a bait called a TRD Ticklers. They're basically 3 variations of the same general concept. A small bait that doesn't have a lot of flashy appendages on it, curl tails, legs that move, things like that. It kind of just hops and glides and slowly falls through the water column. It's made to look like something that is going to be easy to catch for the fish, not put up a big fight. And I think that's why Ned rigging is so effective. So I'm throwing this Hula Sticks rigged on a real lightweight Finesse mushroom head jig, also from Z-Man. It has a really nice soft plastic keeper to keep that bait pinned to the jig head as it works through the water column and through this cover, these weeds that I'm fishing. Now, the central idea behind presenting the Ned Rig is that less is more. It's hard to fish it wrong as long as you're fishing it slow, right? Little hops, little pops, small movements of the bait. Get it to hover in the water column and slowly fall down into those, today, these little nooks and crannies in the weeds where the fish are holding. And while I'm presenting this Ned Rig here in the weeds, I found it to be equally effective around all sorts of cover: rocks, wood, docks, fish cribs, things of that nature. Especially once we get here into the meaty part of the summer. There's a fish. Got him. Where the water temperatures are real high. It's just hard to beat the effectiveness of this super simple bait. Another largemouth here. Go. Largemouth bass, Ned Rig. Several schools of thought when it comes to rods for Ned rigging, and I'm in the camp that believes in a longer, lighter weight rod. So this is a St. Croix Legend Tournament walleye rod. It's a 7-foot 6-inch rod with medium light power, extra fast action. I like really being able to put a lot of leverage behind my cast. The baits are very small and very lightweight. So having a long, medium light power like this one, I think a rod like this one is very effective at propelling these baits a long way and getting as much as I can out of every cast. I have this St. Croix rod rigged with a 3000 series Daiwa Fuego reel, but I think that really a lot of 2500 or 3000 size reels would be appropriate. We're looking for something with a smooth drag to protect the relatively light line that we're using. Now for line, I've got Suffix 832 in this high-vis yellow color. If you've been following along this season, you know that I'm a big line watcher. I'm a strong believer that that high-vis line allows me to visually detect bites that I wouldn't otherwise be able to feel, especially when the bite is off. Now, of course, I don't want that opaque, brightly colored line right next to the lure, and so I've got it finished with a small section of 15-pound Seagar and Vizex fluorocarbon. Right now, that fluorocarbon is important for a lot of reasons. One is that it provides me with much lower visibility at the lure, so a little bit of a stealthy approach there. Fluorocarbon also is very abrasion resistant, and so fishing around all of these weeds, which can nick and abrade and weaken the line, I can avoid that by using a fluorocarbon leader. And using that fluorocarbon also gives me an opportunity to land some of the toothy fish that you're going to encounter when you Ned rig, especially up here in the Northland in terms of walleyes and pike and muskies, and even larger bass that can abrade that line with their little sandpaper teeth in their mouth. And so that braid to fluorocarbon junction is important. I tie in what's called an Alberto knot. And that combination of relatively light, high-vis braid plus a fluorocarbon leader is just a fantastic way to present lots of baits, including the Ned rig like I'm doing today. There's a fish. That one I just came tight and felt him tugging already. Another one of these kind of cookie cutter largemouths. Yep. Ned rigging is certainly an action technique, and in the middle of the summer when action is slow, it's a fantastic way to get lots of bites. Well, as you've seen, Ned rigging is just a fantastic way to put a pile of fish in the boat during the middle of the summer. And I hope that I've given you the confidence to make the Ned rig a key component of your arsenal during those dreaded dog days. Hey, I'm Jason Halfen, the Technological Angler, and I'll see you on the water.